He walked into that cafe as a man who owned entire skylines, but he left as a man who'd just discovered he owned nothing at all. Stay with me, because what happened next wasn't just a love story. It was a collision of two worlds so different they shouldn't have even shared the same air. And yet in 20 seconds, everything he thought he knew about power, worth and destiny shattered like glass under his polished Italian shoes. This isn't about money. It's about what happens when a heart, long frozen by ambition, meets the warmth it didn't know it was dying for. The city never slept, and neither did Dominic Hartwell. At 34, he commanded a tech empire worth billions, his name whispered in boardrooms across 3 continents. He wore power like a second skin, tailored suits that cost more than most people's yearly salary, watches that could fund a small village. But beneath the armor of success, there was a void he refused to acknowledge. His friends, the few real ones left, had been begging him for months to take a break, to remember what it felt like to be human. So when his college roommate Marcus insisted on setting him up on a blind date, Dominic agreed, mostly to stop the nagging. He expected nothing. He anticipated boredom. What he got was everything. The cafe was deliberately chosen to be ordinary, a place where Dominic Hartwell the billionaire could disappear into Dominic Hartwell the man. Marcus had been cryptic about the woman, saying only that she was genuine, kind, and that Dominic needed someone who didn't know his net worth before knowing his name. Dominic arrived 15 minutes early, unusual for him, sitting at a corner table with a black coffee he barely touched. He checked his phone reflexively, emails piling up, stock alerts blinking, the world demanding his attention even here. And then she walked in. Her name was Elena Santos, though he didn't know that yet. What he knew, what his body understood before his mind could process, was that something fundamental had just shifted in the universe. She wore a simple floral dress that had probably come from a thrift store, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, sneakers that had seen better days. She carried a canvas bag with a broken strap, held together with safety pins. She wasn't polished, she wasn't packaged. She was real in a way that made everything else in his life feel like a carefully constructed lie. Their eyes met across the cafe, and Dominic felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. Fear. Not the fear of losing a deal or missing a deadline, but the primal fear of standing at the edge of something so profound it could either destroy you or rebuild you from nothing. Elena approached with a shy smile, apologizing for being 2 minutes late because the bus had been delayed. The bus. Dominic couldn't remember the last time he'd even seen a bus, let alone ridden one. She extended her hand, and when he took it, the touch sent electricity through his entire nervous system. Her hand was rough, calloused from work, warm and alive. His hand, soft from a life of signing papers and shaking hands at galas, felt suddenly inadequate. They sat, and the first thing she said was, "Marcus told me you're in tech. That must be interesting." She didn't know. She genuinely didn't know who he was. And in that moment, Dominic Hartwell experienced something billionaires rarely get to feel: freedom. They talked, and it wasn't like any conversation Dominic had had in years. Elena worked 3 jobs. She was a waitress at a diner in the mornings, a tutor for immigrant children in the afternoons, and she cleaned office buildings at night. She spoke about her students with a light in her eyes that outshone every diamond Dominic had ever seen. She told him about Maria, a 7-year-old from El Salvador who just learned to read in English, and how the girl had cried with joy when she finished her first chapter book. Elena's voice cracked when she shared this, and Dominic realized he was watching someone who measured wealth, not in dollars, but in moments of human transformation. She asked him about his work, and for the first time in his adult life, Dominic didn't launch into his rehearsed pitch about disrupting industries and maximizing shareholder value. Instead, he found himself talking about why he'd started his company, a reason he'd forgotten years ago. He'd wanted to connect people, to make technology serve humanity rather than replace it. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost that vision in the pursuit of zeros in a bank account. Elena listened like listening was an art form, her brown eyes never leaving his face, nodding at the right moments, asking questions that showed she actually cared about the answers. When the waiter came to take their order, Dominic instinctively reached for the wine list. then stopped when he saw Elena studying the menu with intense concentration, her finger moving down the prices. She ordered water and the cheapest item, a side salad. Something cracked inside his chest. This wasn't a woman playing coy or testing him. This was a woman doing the mathematics of survival, calculating whether she could afford lunch and still make rent. Dominic ordered the same, sensing that matching her would make her more comfortable than showcasing the vast canyon between their financial realities. As they ate, Elena told him about her family. Her mother had died when she was 16, leaving her to raise her two younger brothers alone. Her father had disappeared years before, choosing alcohol over his children. She'd worked her way through community college, dreaming of becoming a teacher, but life had other plans. Her brothers needed food, clothes, a roof. Dreams could wait. Survival couldn't. She spoke about this without bitterness, without self-pity, as if hardship was simply the weather she'd learned to navigate. Dominic found himself leaning forward, drawn into her gravity, watching the way her hands moved when she talked, expressive and alive. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, and when he asked about it, she laughed and said she'd gotten it breaking up a fight between her brothers over the last piece of pizza. Family, she said, was worth a few scars. 2 hours passed like 20 minutes. The café began to fill with the lunch crowd, but Dominic and Elena existed in a bubble outside of time. He told her things he'd never told anyone, about the loneliness of success, about how he'd built an empire but couldn't remember the last time he'd had a real conversation. She didn't offer platitudes or solutions. She just listened, and in her listening he felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with his Forbes profile or his corporate achievements. When she excused herself to use the restroom, Dominic sat back and tried to understand what was happening to him. This was illogical, irrational. He'd known this woman for 2 hours, and yet every cell in his body was screaming that he'd just met the most important person in his life. When Elena returned, she glanced at her phone and her face fell. She had to leave for her tutoring session. Dominic felt panic rise in his throat. He wasn't ready for this to end. He wasn't sure he'd ever be ready for this to end. They stood, and he walked her to the door, and on the sidewalk outside under the indifferent afternoon sun, Dominic did something he'd never done before. He asked, not commanded, not expected, but genuinely asked if he could see her again. Elena's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the city, and she said yes, she'd like that very much. They exchanged numbers, and as she walked away toward the bus stop, Dominic stood frozen, watching her disappear into the crowd. In that moment, watching a woman in a thrift store dress and broken sneakers vanish into his city, Dominic Hartwell realized something terrifying and exhilarating. He was in love. Not the cautious, calculated interest he'd felt for the socialites and heiresses who'd orbited his life, but real, devastating, transformative love. The kind that poets wrote about and fools died for, and he'd fallen into it in 2 hours, sitting in a café that didn't even have his name on a reservation list. What Dominic didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he stood on that sidewalk watching Elena disappear, was that falling in love was the easy part. Living in love across the Grand Canyon of their different worlds, that was where the real story would begin. And it would test everything he thought he knew about himself, about power, and about what it truly means to give your heart to another human being. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a fever dream. Dominic, a man who scheduled his life in 15-minute increments, suddenly found himself rearranging board meetings and cancelling international calls just to steal a few hours with Elena. They met in parks, where she'd bring sandwiches she'd made herself, the bread sometimes a day old, because it was discounted at the bakery near her apartment. They walked through neighborhoods Dominic had never visited, despite living in the city for a decade, places where laundry hung between buildings and children played in streets that hadn't seen city maintenance in years. Elena showed him her world not with shame, but with pride, pointing out the community garden, where Mrs. Chen grew vegetables for anyone who needed them, the corner store where the owner let people pay next week if they were short this week. This was a city within his city, operating on currencies he'd never learned. Trust, kindness, mutual survival. Dominic found himself lying awake at 3 in the morning, not thinking about stock prices or acquisition strategies, but replaying the sound of Elena's laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the unconscious habit she had of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. He was a man who'd built an empire on logic and data, and yet here he was, undone by a woman who owned nothing but somehow possessed everything that mattered. His assistant noticed the change first, commenting cautiously that Mr. Hartwell seemed different, lighter somehow. His business partners noticed next, confused when Dominic turned down a golf outing with potential investors to spend Sunday afternoon helping Elena's teenage brothers with their math homework in her tiny apartment. The apartment. God, the apartment. Dominic had properties around the world, penthouses with views that real estate agents described as priceless. But Eleanor's apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up in a building where the elevator had been broken for 2 years. 600 square feet, divided by curtains into separate spaces for her and her brothers. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person. The bathroom had tiles missing and a shower that only produced lukewarm water. And yet, when Dominic sat at her small dining table, eating rice and beans she'd stretched to feed 4 people, he felt more at home than he'd ever felt in his 8,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking Central Park. Her brothers, Miguel and Carlos, 16 and 14, were wary of him at first. They'd seen men come around before making promises to their sister, and they'd learned to measure a man not by his words, but by whether he showed up. So, Dominic showed up. Week after week. He helped Miguel prepare for his SATs, recognizing a brilliant mind trapped by circumstance. He shot basketball with Carlos at the neighborhood court, where his expensive sneakers earned suspicious looks until Carlos vouched for him. Slowly, the brothers began to trust him, and their trust meant more to Dominic than any business deal he'd ever closed. One evening, as Dominic was leaving, Miguel pulled him aside and said simply, "Don't hurt her. She's already been hurt enough." Dominic looked into the eyes of this 16-year-old who'd become the man of the house before he'd learned to shave, and made a promise he intended to keep with every fiber of his being. But the two worlds couldn't stay separate forever. The collision came on a Tuesday evening. Dominic had invited Elena to a dinner, telling her only that it was important to him. He'd arranged for a stylist to meet her, to provide a dress, nothing that would make her uncomfortable but something appropriate for where they were going. Elena had been hesitant, sensing this was stepping into his territory, but she'd agreed because she trusted him. The dinner was a charity gala, one of dozens Dominic attended every year, usually alone or with whatever carefully vetted date his publicist suggested. But this time, he wanted Elena by his side. He wanted the world that knew him as a balance sheet to meet the woman who'd reminded him he had a heart. The moment they walked into the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, Dominic felt Elena's hand tighten on his arm. The room was a cathedral of wealth, crystal chandeliers casting light on gowns that cost more than Elena made in a year, jewelry that could fund her brothers' college educations glittering on throats and wrists. Dominic watched Elena take it all in, saw the exact moment she understood the magnitude of what she'd stepped into. A waiter offered champagne, and Elena's eyes went to the tray, then to the hundreds of glasses circulating the room, doing the mathematics. How many tutoring sessions was each glass worth? How many shifts at the diner? Dominic felt sick. He'd thought he was sharing his world with her. Instead, he was showing her the obscene distance between them. The whispers started almost immediately. People recognized Dominic Hartwell, and the question on everyone's lips was the same. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had no one heard of her? Dominic's business rival, Preston Whitmore, approached with his wife Claudia, a woman who wore her pedigree like armor and her contempt for anyone beneath her tax bracket like perfume. "Dominic, darling, you've been hiding," Claudia purred, her eyes scanning Elena from head to toe with the precision of an assassin. "And who is this charming creature?" Elena extended her hand, introducing herself with quiet dignity, but Claudia barely touched her fingers before turning back to Dominic. "She's delightful. Where did you two meet? I don't believe I've seen her at any of the usual events." The subtext was clear. Elena didn't belong here. Elena, to her credit, smiled and said simply, "We met through a mutual friend. Sometimes the best connections happen outside the usual circles." Throughout the dinner, Dominic watched Elena navigate a world designed to exclude people like her. She used the correct fork, made polite conversation, laughed at the appropriate moments. But he could see the cost. She was performing, translating herself into a language that wasn't native to her soul. When Preston Whitmore asked her what she did, and she mentioned her 3 jobs, the table went silent. Then Preston laughed, actually laughed, and said, "How industrious. I can't imagine working 3 jobs. One is exhausting enough." He meant his position as CEO of a company he'd inherited, where he worked perhaps 20 hours a week. Elena's smile never wavered, but Dominic saw her retreat behind her eyes, saw her building walls he'd spent weeks helping her tear down. The breaking point came during the charity auction. A week at a villa in Tuscany went for $250,000. A private concert from a famous musician, $175,000. Dominic bid on a scholarship fund, winning with a $500,000 pledge, and the room applauded politely. As they clapped, Elena leaned close and whispered, "That's more than I'll make in 10 years. It wasn't accusatory, it was simply a fact, but in that fact was the entire impossible distance between them. They left early, Dominic making excuses about an early meeting. In the car, a silence stretched between them, vast and terrible. Finally, Elena spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" Dominic turned to her, confused. "Tell you what?" She gestured vaguely back toward the hotel. "That you're not just successful. That you're Dominic Hartwell. I looked you up on my phone in the bathroom. Forbes list, multiple covers. Net worth with a B. Dominic, I thought you were maybe a middle manager or something. I had no idea." Her voice cracked, and Dominic reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Do you understand what this means? I can't be part of that world. I don't belong there. Those people, that life, it's not me. It'll never be me." Dominic felt panic claw at his chest. "I don't care about that world. I care about you. Being with you is the first time I've felt alive in years. The money, the status, it means nothing compared to what we have." Elena looked at him with eyes full of tears, and something worse, something that looked like pity. "It means nothing to you because you've always had it. You can't understand what it's like to count every dollar, to choose between electricity and groceries, to watch your brothers go to school in shoes that are too small because you can't afford new ones yet. That money means everything, Dominic. It's security, it's freedom. It's the difference between surviving and living. And the distance between your everything and my nothing, that's not something love can bridge. Not in the real world." They sat outside her building, and Dominic tried to find words that could fix this, that could make her see what he saw. But she was already opening the door, already stepping back into her world, leaving his behind. Before she closed the door, she turned back. "I need time to think. This is all too much. I'm sorry." And then she was gone, disappearing into the building, and Dominic sat in his car, a vehicle that cost more than her annual salary, and realized that for all his wealth and power, he was completely helpless to stop the woman he loved from walking away. Sharing these stories of hearts colliding across impossible divides isn't easy, but if you feel the weight of love that defies logic, the pain of worlds that can't seem to meet, subscribe and join us on this journey. Your like can spread this story to someone who needs to hear it, and your comment can share a truth that might heal another soul searching for hope. Stay with me, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about sacrifice, love, and the choices that define us. The next 2 weeks were hell. Dominic threw himself into work with a desperation that alarmed even his most demanding board members. He took meetings in Tokyo, Dubai, and London, flying across time zones like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. But geography couldn't cure what ailed him. Every coffee shop reminded him of that first meeting. Every woman's laugh on the street made him turn, hoping impossibly to see Elena's face. He'd built an empire on the principle that everything had a price, that every problem had a solution, if you applied enough resources and intelligence. But Elena had shown him the cruel truth. Some things, the most important things, couldn't be bought or strategized into existence. Love didn't respond to market forces. The heart didn't care about quarterly projections. His assistant finally confronted him on a Thursday afternoon when Dominic snapped at her for the 3rd time over a trivial scheduling conflict. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice steady despite his glare. "I've worked for you for 6 years. I've never seen you like this. Whatever happened, whoever she is, you need to fix it or let it go. This halfway existence is destroying you." Dominic wanted to be angry, to remind her of professional boundaries, but he was too tired, too empty. He dismissed her with a wave and sat alone in his office as the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. His phone sat silent. Elena hadn't called, hadn't texted. The silence was its own kind of answer, and it was killing him slowly. What Dominic didn't know was that Elena was going through her own private war. She'd meant what she said about needing time, but time had only made everything more complicated. Because the truth was, she'd fallen in love with him too, completely, irrevocably, in a way that terrified her because she understood better than he did what that love would cost. She lay awake in her small bed, listening to her brothers sleep on the other side of the curtain, and played out every possible future. If she stayed with Dominic, she'd be pulled into his world, that glittering, brutal place where people measured worth in zeros and looked at her like a curiosity, a project, someone to be fixed or elevated. She'd lose herself trying to become someone she wasn't. But if she let him go, she'd lose the man who'd seen her, truly seen her, and loved not despite her poverty but beyond it, as if it were simply a circumstance rather than a definition. Her best friend Rosa found her crying in the diner's back room during her morning shift, makeup running, hands shaking. Rosa had known Elena since childhood, had been there through every hardship, and she sat down and took Elena's hands with the fierce tenderness only true friendship allows. "Tell me," she demanded. So Elena told her everything, the blind date, the café, the way Dominic looked at her like she was something precious, the gala, the impossible gulf between their lives. When she finished, Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Elena hadn't expected. "You think you're protecting yourself by walking away, but you're not. You're punishing yourself. You're deciding you don't deserve happiness because happiness came in a package you didn't expect. That's not wisdom, Mija. That's fear." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Was Rosa right? Had she spent so long surviving, so long making do with less, that she couldn't recognize abundance when it offered itself freely? She thought about Dominic, really thought about him, stripping away the money and the status. What was left? A man who'd helped her brothers with homework, a man who'd sat in her broken apartment and ate beans and rice like it was a feast, a man who'd listened to her talk about her students with genuine interest, who'd asked questions and remembered details, a man who'd looked at her calloused hands and held them like they were made of silk. That man, the real Dominic beneath the billionaire veneer, that was who she'd fallen in love with. The money was just noise, terrifying, overwhelming noise, but noise nonetheless. That night, Elena did something she'd never done before. She called in sick to her evening cleaning job, losing money she couldn't afford to lose, and took her brothers to the park where she and Dominic had spent so many afternoons. She sat Miguel and Carlos down and told them the truth. All of it. Who Dominic really was. How she felt about him. Her fears about the distance between their worlds. She expected them to be angry that she'd hidden this, or worse, to be dazzled by the money, but her brothers had inherited her gift for seeing what mattered. Miguel spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of someone forced to grow up too fast. "Elena, you've given up everything for us. Your education, your dreams. Your whole life has been about making sure Carlos and I had chances you never got. When are you allowed to be happy? When are you allowed to choose something for yourself?" Carlos, younger but no less wise, added, "We like him, Lena, not because he's rich. We didn't even know that. We like him because he shows up, he keeps his promises, and he makes you smile in a way we haven't seen since Mom died. That's worth something. That's worth everything." Elena broke down then, crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years, and her brothers held her, these two kids she'd raised now raising her back, giving her permission to reach for something beyond survival. The decision crystallized in her heart that night. She would call Dominic. She would try. Not because the path would be easy, but because the alternative, a life of wondering what if, was unbearable. But before she could reach for her phone the next morning, there was a knock at her door. 6 a.m. Far too early for visitors. Elena opened it to find Dominic standing there, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. He wore jeans and a simple t-shirt she'd never seen him in. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, completely vulnerable. "I'm sorry," he said before she could speak. "I'm sorry for not understanding what I was asking you to step into. I'm sorry for being so blind to my own privilege that I thought love could just erase the realities of our different lives. You were right. About all of it." Elena started to respond, but Dominic held up his hand. "Please, let me finish. I've spent 2 weeks trying to figure out how to fix this, how to make it work. And I realized I was doing it again, trying to solve it like a business problem, applying resources and strategy. But that's not what this needs. What this needs is honesty. So here's my truth, Elena. I love you. I love you in a way that's rewritten everything I thought I knew about myself. And I can't promise that blending our worlds will be easy. I can't promise that there won't be moments like that gala where the distance feels impossible. But I can promise that I will spend every day trying to understand your experience, trying to be worthy of the gift you'd be giving me by staying. I can promise that your world, the one with 3 jobs and tight budgets and brothers who need raising, that world has taught me more about what matters than my entire life before it." He took a breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want to change you. I don't want to rescue you like some savior complex fantasy. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. If it means I sell everything and we start from scratch, I'll do it. If it means we figure out how to bridge these worlds slowly, carefully, on your terms, I'll do that too. I just need you to know that the only thing I can't do, the only thing that's not negotiable, is losing you. Because these past 2 weeks without you have shown me that all the money in the world can't buy what matters. And what matters is you. It's always been you." Elena stood in her doorway, this woman who'd survived abandonment and loss, who'd raised 2 boys and worked 3 jobs, and never once felt sorry for herself, and she felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the expansive hope of possibility. She stepped forward and took Dominic's face in her hands, those calloused hands that had worked so hard for so long, and she kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a claiming, a decision, a leap into the unknown. When they pulled apart, she said, "I love you too, and I'm terrified. But Rosa told me yesterday that I was letting fear make my decisions, and she's right. So here's what I need. I need you to understand that I'm not a project. I'm not someone to be fixed or elevated. I need to keep working, keep being who I am, even as we figure out how to merge our lives. I need you to respect that my independence isn't pride, it's survival, and I can't just turn that off because you have resources. Can you do that? Can you love me without trying to solve me?" Dominic nodded, and there were tears in his eyes. "Yes, I can do that. I will do that." Elena smiled, and it was the smile that had first captured his heart in that café, genuine and warm and full of life. "Then we try. No promises it'll work. No guarantees we won't crash and burn, but we try." They stood there in her doorway as the sun rose over the city, 2 people from worlds that should never have intersected, choosing each other anyway. Miguel and Carlos appeared behind Elena, still in their pajamas, and Miguel said with a grin, "Does this mean you're staying for breakfast?" "Because I make really good scrambled eggs." Dominic laughed, actually laughed, and said, "I would love that." The following months were an exercise in navigation. Dominic didn't try to change Elena's life overnight. Instead, he entered it carefully, respectfully. He set up college funds for Miguel and Carlos, but structured them so Elena could still be the one making decisions about their education. He offered to help with her rent, but when she refused, he didn't push. Instead, he found other ways. He connected her with a non-profit that hired her as a full-time coordinator for their tutoring program, a job that paid more than her 3 jobs combined and aligned with her passion. It wasn't charity. She interviewed. She competed against other candidates. She earned it. But Dominic had opened the door and Elena walked through it on her own merit. They kept their relationship mostly private, avoiding the social circuit that had been so disastrous before. Dominic found that he didn't miss it. The galas and benefits and networking dinners had been obligations, not pleasures. What he loved was Thursday nights in Elena's apartment, now slightly larger after they'd moved to a better building, watching movies with her brothers. Sunday mornings at the diner where Elena had worked, now as customers, eating breakfast and reading the paper. The simple rhythm of a life built on presence rather than performance. His business partners worried he'd lost his edge, but the opposite was true. Dominic had found his center, and from that center, he led with a clarity and purpose he'd never accessed before. This journey of two hearts learning to beat as one across impossible odds isn't over yet. And if you've felt the terror and beauty of love that doesn't make sense on paper, but makes perfect sense in your soul, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to walk with us through the rest of this story, and hit that like button if you believe that the bravest thing we can do is choose love, even when every logical voice tells us to run. Because what comes next will show you that the real twist, the one no one expected, was never about money or status. It was about something far more valuable and infinitely more rare. 6 months into their relationship, Dominic did something that surprised even himself. He proposed. Not at a fancy restaurant with photographers hidden in the corners, not on a beach at sunset with a ring that cost more than a house. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in Elena's apartment, after helping Carlos with his algebra homework and eating leftover pizza from the weekend. They were sitting on her small couch, Elena's head resting on his shoulder, half watching a documentary about ocean conservation, and Dominic just knew this was it. This ordinary, perfect moment was when he wanted to ask her to build a lifetime of ordinary, perfect moments with him. He didn't have a ring. He'd been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for a week, waiting for the right moment, but he'd left his jacket in the car. So he turned to Elena, took both her hands in his, and said simply, "Marry me. Not because it makes sense, not because we've figured everything out, but because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. I want to be there when Miguel graduates high school, and when Carlos gets his driver's license, and when your students learn to read, and when you're old and grey and still the most beautiful person I've ever seen. Marry me, Elena, please." Elena stared at him, her eyes wide, and for a terrifying moment Dominic thought she'd say no, that this was too much, too fast, too impossible. But then she started laughing, that bright, joyful laugh that had become his favorite sound in the world, and she said, "You don't even have a ring." Dominic laughed too, dizzy with relief. "I have a ring, it's in my car, I just couldn't wait. I've spent my whole life planning and strategizing and waiting for the perfect moment. But you've taught me that the perfect moment is just the one where you're brave enough to say what's true. And the truth is I love you and I want you to be my wife." Elena kissed him then, soft and deep, and when she pulled back she whispered, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Miguel and Carlos, who'd been pretending not to listen from the kitchen, erupted in cheers, and suddenly the small apartment was full of celebration. 4 people who'd become a family, jumping and hugging and crying happy tears. Dominic retrieved the ring from his car, a vintage emerald surrounded by small diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother, the only member of his family who'd loved without condition. When he slid it onto Elena's finger, it fit perfectly, as if even fate was conspiring to prove they belonged together. But of course an engagement meant telling people, and that's when the real complications began. Dominic's family, what little remained of it, was not pleased. His father had passed away years ago, but his mother, Catherine Hartwell, was very much alive and very much opposed to the union. She arrived at Dominic's penthouse unannounced one morning, let in by his doorman who knew better than to refuse her. Dominic woke to find his mother sitting in his living room, her face a mask of controlled disapproval. "Dominic," she began without preamble, "I've heard the rumors, but I refused to believe them until I had confirmation from you directly. Is it true? Are you actually planning to marry this waitress?" Dominic felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Her name is Elena. She's not a waitress anymore. She's a program coordinator for a literacy non-profit. And yes, I'm going to marry her. I love her." His mother laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "Love? How pedestrian. Dominic, you are the heir to an empire. Do you have any idea what this marriage will do to your reputation? To the company? The board is already expressing concerns. This woman has no education, no family name, no connections. She brings nothing to the table. It was the nothing that broke Dominic's carefully maintained composure. She brings everything to the table, Mother. Everything that actually matters. She's kind, she's brilliant. She's raised 2 incredible kids on her own. She's shown me what it means to have integrity, to work for something bigger than yourself. What have all your connections and names and reputations brought you? You're miserable. You've been miserable my entire life. You married for status and money, and look where it got you. A loveless marriage that ended in a bitter divorce, and a son you only contact when you're worried about appearances. His mother stood, her face flushed with rare emotion. You are throwing away everything your father and I built, everything we sacrificed for you. Dominic stood too, facing her across the expensive living room that had never felt like home. No, Mother, I'm finally understanding what's worth building. And if the cost of loving Elena is your approval, or the board's blessing, or high society's acceptance, then that's a cost I'll pay gladly, because she's worth more than all of it combined. His mother left without another word, and Dominic knew he'd just severed one of his last connections to the world he'd been born into. It should have hurt more than it did. Instead, he felt liberated. The wedding was small, intimate, and entirely on Elena and Dominic's terms. They rented a community center in Elena's neighborhood, the same one where she tutored, and decorated it with flowers from the local bodega and lights strung by Miguel and Carlos. The guest list was 50 people, mostly Elena's students and their families, some of Dominic's genuine friends from college, Rosa and her family. And conspicuously, no one from Dominic's business or social circles except Marcus, the friend who'd set them up, who served as Dominic's best man. Elena wore a simple white dress she'd found at a vintage shop, and Dominic wore a suit, but he'd removed the designer label and loosened his tie. Miguel walked Elena down the aisle, his face serious with the weight of the honor, and when he placed her hand in Dominic's, he whispered, "Take care of her. She's the best person I know." Dominic whispered back, "I know. I promise." The ceremony was officiated by the director of the literacy non-profit, a woman named Gloria, who'd known Elena for years and who spoke about love not as a feeling but as a choice, made new every day. When Dominic and Elena exchanged vows, they'd written them themselves. Dominic promised to honor Elena's independence, to listen more than he solved, to remember that wealth was measured in moments, not money, to be worthy of the gift of her trust. Elena promised to let Dominic in, to share her burdens instead of carrying them alone, to believe that accepting help wasn't weakness but love, to build a future together that honored both their pasts. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The reception was potluck, everyone bringing dishes from their cultures and traditions, the tables groaning with food that cost almost nothing but tasted like everything. There was music from a DJ who volunteered his time, dancing that went late into the night, and toasts that were heartfelt and real. Dominic's college friend Jake gave a speech about how he'd watched Dominic become more human in the past year than in all the years before, and Elena's student Maria, now 8 years old, read a poem she'd written about how love was like learning to read, because both made the world bigger and more beautiful. When Dominic and Elena had their first dance, swaying to a song Carlos had chosen, Dominic whispered in her ear, "This is the happiest day of my life." Elena pulled back to look at him, and her eyes were shining. "Mine too. Every single day with you is the happiest day of my life." But the real twist, the one nobody expected, came 3 weeks after the wedding. Dominic and Elena had just returned from their honeymoon, a week in a small cabin upstate, where they'd hiked and read and made love and talked about their future. They were unpacking in the larger apartment they'd rented together, big enough for all 4 of them, when Elena's phone rang. It was a lawyer calling about her father. The father who'd abandoned them when Elena was a child, who she hadn't heard from in over 15 years. He'd passed away, the lawyer explained, and he'd left something for Elena. Not money, there was no money, but a letter and a small box. Elena stood in her new living room, holding her phone with a shaking hand, and Dominic watched her face cycle through emotions. Grief for the father she'd never really known, anger for the years he'd been absent, confusion about why he'd thought of her at the end. The letter arrived 2 days later, and Elena held it for an hour before she found the courage to open it. Dominic sat beside her, holding her free hand, as she read words her father had written in the final days of his life. The letter was an apology, raw and honest. He explained about his addiction, about the shame that had made him run, about the years he'd spent trying to get clean and failing. He'd followed Elena's life from a distance, the lawyer tracking her through public records, and he'd known about her brothers, about the jobs, about the sacrifices. He wrote that his greatest regret was not being brave enough to come back to try to make amends, to tell her that everything good in him had gone into making her, and she'd taken that goodness and multiplied it in ways he could never have imagined. In the box was a single photograph, creased and faded. Elena as a toddler, sitting on her father's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in her father's handwriting, were the words, "Before I forgot how to be happy, you were my happiness." Elena broke down, sobbing in a way Dominic had never seen, grieving not just for the father she'd lost, but for the father she'd never gotten to have. Dominic held her, and Miguel and Carlos held her, and they let her mourn the complicated truth that you can hate someone for leaving and still love the memory of who they were before the leaving. That night, after her brothers had gone to bed, Elena and Dominic sat on their small balcony, looking out over the city lights. "I thought I'd processed losing him years ago," Elena said quietly. "But reading that letter, seeing that picture, it brought it all back. The little girl who waited by the window thinking he'd come home. The teenager who stopped waiting. The woman who convinced herself she didn't need a father. They're all still in me, Dominic. All those versions of me who were hurt by his leaving." Dominic pulled her closer. "I know. And they're all part of who you are. The woman I fell in love with wasn't built in spite of that pain. She was built through it. Your father's absence taught you to show up. His addiction taught you the value of being present. His failure taught you how to succeed at what matters. That doesn't make his choices right, but it makes you extraordinary." Elena turned to look at her husband, this man who'd traveled from a world of privilege to meet her in her world of survival, and she realized the real twist wasn't about him falling in love with a poor girl. It wasn't even about them defying the odds to build a life together. The real twist was about redemption. Her father, broken and lost, had still managed to give the world Elena. Elena, shaped by hardship, had still managed to give the world kindness. And Dominic, trapped by wealth, had found freedom in love. They were all of them, every character in this story, people trying to find their way back to something true. And maybe, Elena thought, that was what life was. Not the absence of pain, but the choice to build beauty anyway. Not the erasure of your past, but the courage to let it teach you rather than define you. 6 months later, Elena discovered she was pregnant. The news came on an ordinary Wednesday, and when she told Dominic, he cried. Not sad tears, but overwhelmed tears, the tears of a man who'd thought his life was complete, and then discovered it had just been waiting to expand. They told Miguel and Carlos over dinner, and the boys were ecstatic, already arguing about whether they wanted a niece or nephew, and making plans about all the things they'd teach the baby. That night, lying in bed with Dominic's hand on her still flat stomach, Elena thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a blind date in a café to a family being born, from 2 separate worlds to one shared life, from survival to thriving. She thought about her mother gone too soon, and her father, lost to his demons, and she made them both a silent promise. This child, and any others that followed, would grow up knowing they were loved. They would grow up seeing that love could bridge any distance, that worth wasn't measured in bank accounts, and that the bravest thing you could do was choose connection, even when it was terrifying. Dominic stirred beside her, his voice sleepy. "What are you thinking about?" Elena smiled in the darkness. "Everything. How strange life is. How a year ago I was working 3 jobs and barely surviving, and now I'm here, married to you, carrying our child, and it feels like a dream I'm afraid to wake up from." Dominic's arms tightened around her. "It's not a dream. It's real. We're real. And we're going to build something beautiful together. You, me, Miguel, Carlos, this baby, and whoever else joins our family along the way. We're going to prove that love doesn't care about tax brackets or pedigrees or any of the artificial divisions people use to separate themselves from each other. We're going to be disgustingly happy." Elena laughed, that bright, beautiful laugh, and said, "Disgustingly happy. I like the sound of that." And they were. Disgustingly, impossibly, wonderfully happy, not because their life was perfect or because the obstacles disappeared. Dominic's business still demanded his time. Elena still worked hard at the non-profit, expanding it into 3 more cities. Miguel went to college on a full scholarship, studying engineering. Carlos became captain of his basketball team. The baby, a girl they named Rosa after Elena's best friend, grew up in a home filled with laughter and books and people from every walk of life. Dominic's mother eventually came around, though it took the birth of her granddaughter to soften her. She would never fully approve, but she learned to love, and that was enough. The story could end here with the fairy tale complete. But the truth is, stories don't end. They just continue, chapter after chapter, with new challenges and joys and sorrows woven together. Dominic and Elena's marriage wasn't perfect. They fought about money sometimes, about how to raise Rosa, about whose turn it was to handle the dishes. But they fought fair, and they always came back to each other, remembering that their love was a choice they were making every single day. And that choice, renewed over and over, was the real magic. Not the billionaire falling for the poor girl, not the rags-to-riches transformation, but 2 people seeing each other fully and deciding that what they saw was worth keeping, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. So what's the twist no one expected? It's not that Dominic rescued Elena. It's not that Elena changed Dominic. It's that they rescued each other. He saved her from a life of pure survival, showing her that she could dream again. She saved him from a life of pure success, showing him that he could feel again. Together they built something neither could have built alone: a family, a love, a life that mattered not because it was wealthy or famous or particularly special to anyone but them, but because it was real, because it was chosen, because it was theirs. This was the journey of 2 souls who found each other across impossible distances. But there are so many other stories waiting to be told, so many other hearts searching for connection in a world that often feels designed to keep us apart. If you've ever felt the ache of being seen, truly seen by another person, if you've ever taken a leap of faith into love, even when logic told you to run, then you understand what Dominic and Elena found. Join our community by subscribing, share your own story in the comments below, and let's celebrate together the messy, beautiful, terrifying reality of opening your heart to another human being. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're all here for. Not to accumulate or achieve or impress, but to connect, to love, to remember that we're all just people trying to find our way home to each other. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Until next time, may you have the courage to choose love even when it doesn't make sense, especially when it doesn't make sense.